I think when I was about 10 years old, I started singing in Episcopalian boys choir.
Oh.
And I sang in the choir until my voice changed, which got me close to junior high school. And in junior high school, for some reason on the intercom, it came across that the junior high school band needed a flute player. And I thought, well, that would be interesting. So I had visions of being a flute player, but when I met the band director, he looked at me and said, "No, you're going to play trombone." I said, "Well, okay then." And so my fate was sealed, and I became a trombone player. And I was very fortunate in the early days in junior high to have a really gifted teacher that was a high school band director, but he was also an aficionado for jazz and jazz trombone, and he loved the Four Freshmen. He loved vocals music as well. So a group of us that studied with him all became real serious trombone players. And he was also a writer and arranger, so we all became, in junior high school, interested in how to do that. So by the time I got to high school, I was doing solo work in the band, in the jazz band, the concert band, and actually doing some very primitive writing. And occasionally I could even conduct the jazz band. The high school band director would just sort of give it to me and say to do this. But when I was 15, I lived on the Space Coast, Merritt Island, out in the early days of the space program. And the astronauts, the 7 original astronauts, bought a club on Cocoa Beach that was the Club of the Astronauts, and it was a really popular club. And there was a guy in town in Cocoa Beach that started a big band. And it was really difficult finding players in that area because at that time it wasn't grown up like it is now. And I was the only trombone player he could find in the area that would do it. And I was only 15, and it was very much a union band. So they had to make an allowance because they didn't accept anybody in the union under 16. So I got accepted into that. And then I started doing some more primitive arranging when I was 16. I'll never forget, my first arrangement was an arrangement of Winchester Cathedral.
Oh, wow.
That shows you how far back that goes. But pretty much I was bitten by the bug. When I was in my senior year in high school, a touring group called the Spurlows came through, played a high school show, and that's what the group did. They went to high schools all around the country playing shows, and they were sponsored by Chrysler. And they were known as Chrysler's Clean Cut Kids. And so I was really blown away by the band. It was a very good band. It was the first really truly professional band I'd heard. And they mentioned that they were taking auditions for the next year's tour. So I auditioned for that and got the audition for that band. And then after my senior year in high school, I spent a year touring through through 40 states and Canada, and which was an eye-opener for a kid from Merritt Island. But I got to see the music business up close, and it was a very professional group. It was a good experience, but after 1 year, I was tired of it and decided I would like to go to college. Long story short. My first year, I was a jazz composer in residence. And then, because I understand, given the conditions, they obviously wanted to see if I would work out. Fortunately, it did work out, and Lowell Hepworth at that time, who was a good friend, was sort of in charge of the jazz area after Bill Fowler left. And then I got on tenure track and was appointed as director of jazz studies, which that was in the mid-'70s, and of course it's been that way ever since. And so as far as the jazz area goes, that was sort of the backstory on that.
Yeah.
And so I was in the spotlight, and the band was a really good band. I mean, it had players left over from from Bill Fowler days, and I had some very gifted players who went on and are still first call studio players in the LA area. So I had a very good band, and since there were so few schools, I took the band. We performed a lot. We went on the road a lot. We did all the major California competitions: Northridge, Orange Coast, Berkeley, Reno, and then later on, when the jazz, the Lionel Hampton Jazz Festival developed up in Moscow, Idaho, I became an integral part of that. I was the clinician for that for 22 years, and the band played up there a lot. And then the band started playing other competitions, festivals, like in Greeley, Colorado, and the players were picking up outstanding festival performers all over the place. And so I felt good that the area grew, and the reputation was good. And then many years later, when Robert Walzell became chair, interestingly enough, he got his DMA from North Texas, which is now is UNT, University of North Texas.
Yeah.
And so he was very aware of my background and everything, because if you come from the same university in graduate school, you pretty much know what's going on there. So he was incredibly supportive of the jazz area, and he gave me the mandate. He said, "I want you to develop a master's program in jazz," and gave me a year off. So I went to University of Miami. I already knew the North Texas curriculum. I went to Ohio State, a couple other places, did the research, and spent a couple months writing it up and coming up with a proposal. He tweaked it a little bit, sent it in. It sailed right through, no problem with the Senate.
Oh, great.
So that started, I think, in 2005 or 2006, I forget. And that program immediately took off. It had some extraordinarily talented students that went through. And I think one of the things I'm most proud of, besides obviously keeping the jazz area going, was working with classical composers and integrating with that area. And my own writing, since I studied with an excellent classical composer, I knew the language, definitely the 12-tone. I wrote a lot. In fact, the piece that got me this job was the first, as far as I've ever been able to find out, first published composition for jazz band. It was a total 12-tone piece, serialized also with microtonality, with quarter tones.
What piece is that?
It was called Spirit of Things to Come. But that piece actually, I think, helped me land this job. And so I became friends in the 70s with the person in charge of the classical music. In fact, I was on the search committee for MAURICE, Miguel, and Steve Romans.
Yeah.
Ramiro Cortez was head of the classical area, and he and I became good friends, and we socialized a lot, and we just enjoyed each other's company. And he was not a jazz composer at all. He didn't write any jazz, but he didn't dislike it, and in fact, he wasn't disparaging of it. So my woodwind quintet that I had written, I'd started working on it at North Texas, but I didn't finish it till later in the 70s. In 76 was selected as won some competition, international competition. It was recorded by a group called the Clarion Wind Quintet, which is my first professional recording. And that recording was used for Voice of America. It was broadcast all over Europe, and it got a lot of play. And so Ramiro liked that piece, and he decided that we should do an album together. I had written another piece for a suite for Baroque ensemble. It was essentially a Baroque piece based on the idea of the Bach two-part inventions, which for me are still one of the masterworks that I still enjoy studying and playing and looking at. And I've written a lot of pieces based on those models a lot of pieces. I did a lot of study on all of them, all of the inventions. I love teaching the inventions, and I love writing in that style. So that piece was, between Ramiro and I, sort of cemented our relationship, and in the eyes of the faculty, I think, too, they could see that there wasn't like a separation between the jazz and the classical, which was really, really important to me, because and our dean knew then that I was working on a symphony, and so he was able to get the Utah Symphony to commit to doing a premiere of my first symphony.
Wow.
And that was called Lydian Horizon. I've always been interested in modal writing as well, really interested in modal writing. And so this was basically based on the Lydian mode, so I called it Lydian Horizon. And it was premiered by the orchestra, I think, in 1982. Verojan Kojin conducted it. He came the year after our dean. But he didn't last too long with the Utah Symphony. But anyhow, he was the conductor. And then they submitted it to a competition that I knew nothing about. It's called the Friedheim Awards. And it was like to take all the new music pieces for orchestra that year and select the top one. So I was a semifinalist in that. In other words, they whittled it down to 10. So that piece, for my first really big orchestral piece, was a semifinalist in the Friedheim Awards, which at that time was a pretty big deal. It no longer exists, but at that time, that was pretty good. That was sort of like getting a Grammy nailed, to the final 10 for the Grammy nomination, that sort of thing. And then the orchestra bug bit me really hard. So after the symphony worked and I got some credibility with the orchestra, then Silverstein came on, and Silverstein liked my work a lot, and he would become a champion. He did so many of my pieces. In 1990, the Utah Arts Festival started a program to commission classical works for orchestra. This was when the early days of the festival, when the Utah Symphony played at the opening of the Arts Fest every year. It was a given. And so I was given the first commission, and then I was asked to then run the program after that, which I did for many years till the program ceased to exist. But so the first piece that was commissioned was Forest, which I've also done for Wind Symphony as well. I've arranged for Wind Symphony. But the original piece, Forest, Silverstein did, and he did it quite a few times. And I got to know him, and it was fun. I got to hang out with him, and he was just a fun person to be with. And I really liked back in those days, at the end of an orchestra concert, a composer or a person, a friend or whatever, could go backstage and could go directly to his office and, socialize. And he'd always be really happy. Yeah, come on in. It was great. And so I got very comfortable with the orchestra, and then Larry Zalkin commissioned me to write a trombone concerto for him. And that is one of my most significant works to date. If I have to pick out one of my trombone concerto is definitely the one that made with the end of Silverstein's reign. And so they took that one on tour. It was premiered here, got 2 nights, Friday and Saturday, and then I went along with the symphony to talk about, give a pre-concert lecture on it. And I'm still performing trombone at this point. I was playing in a salsa group, Salsa Brava. And so I had taken my horn with me just to practice, to keep in shape while I was on the road with the symphony. We were down in St. George, and Rusty McKinney got sick and couldn't play. So I was asked to sub for him in the symphony. So I got to play on my own piece. I got to play in the section on my own trombone concerto. And I even got paid for it. I got a check from the Utah Symphony for performing with the symphony. So I can also say, yeah, I played with the Utah Symphony. So we were just in the ABRAVANEL room, and I'll tell you my Maurice ABRAVANEL story. When was it? It was in the 80s. There was mention of the Utah Symphony wanted to do a work about Utah, something about Utah. And they weren't aware of any pieces, so they commissioned a composer, a New York composer, who was a friend of Maurice's. But at that point, another of the classical composers that has shaped my writing has been Oliver Messiaen. Messiaen, I studied him when I was in graduate school. I learned about Oliver Messiaen. And I told you earlier I was interested in modality, and of course Messiaen had his limited modes of transposition, which I studied thoroughly, and it really informed a lot of my music. So I was, of course, well aware of From the Canyon to the Stars that Messiaen wrote in southern Utah. There's even a peak named after Messiaen, Mount Messiaen. So I wrote sort of a blistering editorial saying, well, this is outrageous. If you want a Utah piece, here's one of the most significant pieces probably ever written or will be written about the state by one of the most significant composers. And you're bringing X from New York in, and he did something that was very lightweight, very lightweight. He spent like one day, went down to Canyonlands, spent one day, then came back and went back to New York and out over his loft wrote this piece that's supposed to represent Utah. And I was just, I was furious about that. Well, I actually get a call from Maurice, and he's furious with me. Young man, how could you say such a thing? And I said, well, Maestro, I'm honored that you called, but I said, I really felt that, and now the orchestra's done it. I mean, they've done it since 2010, I think they finally got around to performing that piece. And I just said, this is the way I felt. I said, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, stir the waters. And we started chatting, and he became quite friendly, and invited me over to his study. And so, I mean, I was sitting in his study, and we were chatting, and it wasn't much in the distant future when he would be gone. And so when the university got his study, I was just flabbergasted, and I was really surprised how well the university, did in representing, especially where he kept his scores, and he was very finicky about it. I remember I borrowed a score from him, and I didn't have to wear white gloves at the time, but and so I was glad that I did have a chance to at least say I got to know him at that level. Program. Another piece that was fairly significant that gets sort of lost in the shuffle is a three-work ballet I did for the Boise Chamber Orchestra and their professional ballet troupe. And that was done in 1992. It was about a 20-minute work, ballet in 3 acts, Earth, Water, and Fire. And NPR got hold of it, and they recorded it, and it was broadcast nationally on NPR Performance Today with an interview, and that's around someplace. And then it went over so well, they wanted me to expand it to have a narrator and a singer. So I went back and did more research, and on that I had a year sabbatical that I took off, and just myself and my dog went to the tribal reservations, and I did field research by actually going, like the bear dance that I transcribed. That was really a Ute bear dance that I got permission to camp on the Ute reservation, and I heard there was a bear dance going on, but I had absolutely no idea how to find it, where it was. And I was camping, and I had my permit to camp, and one of their rangers came up to check out my permit, and which fortunately I had, and I said, I'm here for the bear, and I said, oh really? He says, I'll show you. And it was like several miles away on a dirt road, and I found it, and it was as authentic as you get.
Yeah, that's true.
And it was so authentic, in fact, the bear dance, women asked the men to dance. And there were more women than men at the dance. And I was the only non-native at the whole area. And one of the women came up and and of course I had, and I'm I don't even know how to do, I don't dance at all.
Yeah.
I don't do any kind of dancing. And my wife will attest to that. I don't dance. And but the bear dance, fortunately, I could follow her. And so the research I did for Forever Yesterday was authentic research.
Yeah. Wow.
And I went to a powwow up in Idaho where I was invited to go to a Sundance, which would be 4 days of pure misery out in the desert, and I just I wasn't strong enough for that. I demurred, but and for that, I ended up purchasing authentic instruments. For instance, from that powwow, I got a very authentic elk skin drum, and I picked up a Sioux flute, not the kind that you buy at the shops in Moab, but a real authentic Sioux flute, which I learned how to play and write for. So for that performance, I specified whoever's playing first flute has to take this instrument and learn how to play it. And they were delighted to do that. So the piece actually has the Sioux flute on it as well as the regular. And it has several of the traditional hand instruments too. Yeah, so then it was performed with the extra songs and narration in 1995. And I'm so delighted to see that every time I visit campus, there are new rooms and new facility and things. Everything is growing, and I'm just delighted the School of Music is staying right on top of things. It's great to see that.
That's great.
Now that was your first question. Next.
And I noticed that a number of pieces are named after kind of Utah places or Utah things, like brine shrimp or so.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you had a.
It was them old brine shrimp that ate Salt Lake City blues.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you see, at the time, in the 70s, there was a real cheeky movie. That was the name of it, The Brine Shrimp That Ate Salt Lake City.
Oh,
And it was a real cheeky thing where where giant brine shrimp are taking over, but giant seagulls then come in and eat the brine shrimp,
like
and they perch on the Moroni statue on the temple. And so that was real popular at the time, underground thing. So that was a real tongue-in-cheek sort of thing.
Wow.
But yes, definitely a lot of my pieces, because other than teaching and writing music and raising my kids, I hiked a lot and went into the backcountry a lot. And fortunately, I had friends one friend that had an old boat out on Lake Powell at Height Marina, and it was a boat that was used as a tour boat by Tex, the original guy that used to be the river runner in Moab, called Texas Tours. And he had this big boat with a couple of car engines in it that he decided he would downsize, get rid of, and then get a jet boat. So my friend bought this boat, took out the engines, and put in a new transom and put on outboard engines, and it is a floating behemoth. It was a 2-level thing, and it was huge. You could fit 30 people on it. And this was Tom Smith, and he had many good friends in the orchestra. He was he loved classical music, and he loved jazz, and he was very good friends with Doug Craig and quite a few other members of the symphony. So in the summers, he'd invite a bunch of symphony players, as well as jazz players, myself and other friends, just to float. And this is when the river was high. We could float up canyons. We could float up White Canyon. We'd float up Dark Canyon. We'd float up all these canyons, and then just pull in and camp. And he would invite players to bring their instruments. So the symphony players would bring their instruments, jazz players would bring theirs, and then at night everybody would play. It'd be like either symphony stuff or it'd be jazz or combinations of people just improvising. And it was just a delightful time, really. Like Powell Canyons, that really directly came from Powell Canyons and canyons I was in. That was not making stuff up. The Dirty Devil, which was one of my favorite canyons. White Canyon, which you can hike, you can either get to from the lake or you can actually hike from the road. And Dark Canyon, which the lake is so low now that you can't, it's really hard to get in there. But at the time, the bottom of Dark Canyon, and that's part of the national park, you can still hike it from the other end in. It's a couple-day hike. Yeah, so I hiked all those canyons, and yeah, when I gave those names, I was seriously thinking of those places.
Yeah.
I've been Black Dragon Canyon. That's one you drive into in the San Rafael Swell, and the reason it's called Black Dragon, it's curvy like a dragon's tail, and yeah, I love that canyon. On the way to Powell, I would always camp my first night there, and then head down and hit Hype Marina the second day. So, yeah. Good question. I would have to divide it into jazz, chamber music, and orchestral.
Yeah.
For orchestral, undoubtedly, the first symphony, Lydian Horizon by the Utah Symphony, that was a life-altering experience. The next one was Forests that Joey conducted many times. And then, but the most significant piece for me would be my trombone concerto.
Yeah.
Yeah, without doubt. I love all my, I don't know, that's wrong. I don't love all my orchestral works, but I really like some. And let me think. The chamber music work that I wrote for Bob Wazell Gone Playing, I like that a lot. For a sort of jazz pops piece, I think Black Dragon Canyon is quite good. Not as a classical piece, but as a pops piece for orchestra. Letting Midnight Out on Bail for two pianos, that would almost equal my trombone concerto. The two are probably tied. I was very pleased with Powell Canyons, and is getting another performance. I might go up to New York for that and see Madeline again. For the chamber works, I think my most significant work is my string quartet, the Old Gypsy, because the Old Gypsy, the movement, which really is the most significant music of, I was in Budapest doing some recording sessions. I recorded the music for the 2002 Olympics here in Utah, but it was what started all this. When I was doing that orchestral thing, I went to a restaurant with the producer, and it was a very authentic Hungarian restaurant where they actually had a violinist going around and serenading people at tables. And this violinist comes up, stands right next to me. Of course, they're wanting tip money, but he played me one of the most gorgeous melodies that I couldn't believe it. And I asked, they said, well, that's a very traditional gypsy tune. So I had a napkin, and I made some staff paper, and I wrote out the tune on the napkin, and I took it back with me, and then used that for the basis of the most important part of the string quartet, the Old Gypsy. And that's why I really love that one, because that was literally a transcription of a traditional gypsy that the guy played in my ear. So that was a fun one too. So it's funny how things, just one thing leads to another, and so that was another very authentic movement. And I think the more authentic they are, the more I'm pleased with them. As far as the jazz works go, I really like them all. The one that I like the most is the signature tune for my album, which came out in 2016, which also Chris Johnson plays on. He soloed on 3 of the pieces. It was so nice. I mean, he was just barely into town. I was doing the recording session, and he said, "Sure, man, I'll come over and play it." And it's just so beautiful. It just lifted the album right on up. And so that particular work in C is one of my jazz favorites. But since I'm retired, I've been putting all of the early works into Sibelius.
Yeah.
I have a publisher, eJazz, who will publish anything I give them. There's no questions. Anything I give them, in fact, they promise to have it up online within 2 days,
Wow.
rather than waiting 6 months like most other publishers. So it's just been great. Anything I complete and send will be online within a week.
Oh.
And online with both a recording and a score sample. I mean, they really do it right. The thing I'm very proud of, I'm glad you asked this, is a piece the only piece I wrote, including electronics, is called This House of Sky. It's my first piece with DX7, and I was really interested then because one could make so many different sounds. And this was, I'd stopped writing jazz at this point. I'm only interested in writing orchestral music, but I wanted to write a chamber music piece. For me, it'd be a new frontier with the DX7. It was a DX7 too. So I wrote a piece. I've been reading Ivan Doig, and one of his books that really got to me was called This House of Sky. This House of Sky was written from a very remote little place in Montana that Ivan Doig grew up in. It's a very poetic, beautiful book of growing up in Montana and the land, everything. And Ivan Doig is, I read everything else after that Doig wrote, and I just loved it. So I wrote This House of Sky based on that book. Later on, I was able to find out where that book was written, and I went up there and spent a week at a cabin. And the only thing left in that little town was the old schoolhouse that he talked about in the book. One farmhouse, an old broken down house that I knew the owner, and that, so I was able to actually authentically, once again pull that together. So,
Wow.
And it was the experimentation with the DX7. Unfortunately, the piece can't be done without the DX7, which is.
Oh, yeah.
But I do have I made a DAT tape of it, so it could be done if somebody wanted to do it. Anyhow, so I wrote this piece, which is for chamber group, and I love that work. That's for all my chamber groups, that would be the most significant work. I love the integration with the DX7, a lot of the early sounds, which would then become standardized for a lot of people. The middle movement, which is no DX7 with is just piano and the instruments, and then the final movement that combines them both. Yeah, I love that piece.